All right, students, very good morning. So today we are going to discuss about some of the topics that are left out from the chapter that is biodiversity and conservation. So let us begin with where we stopped. Okay. So loss of biodiversity and its impacts. So yesterday, while we were talking about the loss of biodiversity, we really looked into some of the very key aspects of what is happening. So in loss of biodiversity, we understood that it has become very inevitable because of the human activities. So that has resulted in various catastrophic events in loss of biodiversity. Okay. So there are several reasons for loss of biodiversity. Okay. So some of the reasons naturally that happens is rapid change in the climatic conditions or the environment they stay in, or change in the ecological patterns, change in the pH, okay, change in the soil composition, or any of the flooding. Okay. So some extreme scenarios that will lead to the loss of biodiversity. Apart from that, it's very less compared to that of what human activities have resulted in. So we also discussed about what has resulted till now. So IUCN red listed in 2004, as I said, 784 species. They say that it is extinct, and in that we have 338 vertebrates, 359 invertebrates, and 87 plant species. So in the last 500 years, so some of the organisms that have went extinct is dodo, and then we have stellar sea cow, Russian sea cow we call it as, and then we have Tylasin, which is from Australia, and then we have three of the species from subspecies from Bali, Java, and Caspian of the tigers. Okay, so now coming to the loss of biodiversity, the reasons why this happens in naturally is decline in plant production. So this is first cause. Second one is environmental progression such as droughts, floods, etc. Next one is increased variation in the ecosystem. Okay, so as I said, when there is a lot of variation, which is with respect to ecological changes or with pests or disease, one species get eliminated and it results in the others. But the main concern for the biodiversity is always been human loss. I mean, like human activities. So, under human activities, we can construct this into four main reasons, which we call it as the evil quadrant. Here we have habitat loss and fragmentation, overpopulation, overexploitation, alien species invasion, and co-extinction are the factors. Okay, so let us look at each of them. So when we talk about habitat loss and fragmentation, so this is very easy to imagine and very easy to understand the situation here. So whenever we talk about habit loss and fragmentation, you know the expanding population. So the expanding population and the desire for industrialization and urbanization has resulted in unchecked proportions of human expansion. So in the earlier days, what used to happen, agriculture would be the major concerns for the loss of biodiversity. And the reason was very, very simple, because our agricultural practices are still primitive, but in the older days, it was even more primitive, where we had slash and burn kind of an agricultural practice. Even now it is practiced, but it's quite less compared to what we have faced earlier. A lot of forest area had been covered because of the agriculture for cultivation of crops and for the construction of towns and cities and industrialization. And moreover, when we talk about some of the examples that has resulted during the process, you can see here in our country alone, we had around 14. See, the total rainforest cover is from 14 to 16%. Okay, so now when we talk about our own perspective, like if you look at India and how we have faced biodiversity loss and the fragmentation, even here what is happening, you can see that there is unplanned, for example, you have a large forest area and then you put four roads. Now you can see that the forest has been fragmented into four parts. Okay, so this is a very ecologically sensitive uh, uh, things that to be doing to that will lead to the destruction of biodiversity. And moreover, if you see some of the extreme examples, such as if you take Amazon, in Amazon rainforest, you can see that there has been a huge crisis that's been happening for the past decade, where Amazon is a very very important biodiversity hotspot, we can tell, because of its species richness and because of its contribution to our Earth, 20% of the oxygen is pumped by the Amazons. Now you can see that a large area of the Amazon is being cleared for the cultivation of palm oil and soybean. Okay, so a lot of indigenous communities have been involved in actually supporting against this cause of cultivation of soybean or palm trees. Okay, and the other examples is conversion of grasslands for the cattle farms. Okay, so this is really bad. Why? Because many of the species are very, very sensitive to the environments they live in. So in case if something happens, like any of these factors that lead to the extinction, then an entire ecosystem can get affected. Okay. So, some of the organisms such as migratory birds and elephants and these animals, they cover a very large distance for their survival, so they have a pattern of living, and it is not okay to just obstruct this pattern of living, like migration patterns or hibernation or estivation. Any of these biological patterns, if it is affected because of any of this, it cannot survive. The organism will find it very, very hard. Simple example is, you can see that the Siberian birds, they migrate all the way towards India, and they do it because they like one specific climatic condition and the resources available around them and the food they eat, etc. Now imagine that these areas get affected because of human activities such as habitat loss or you have fragmentation. So when you do that, these migratory birds cannot adjust to this new climate because it is completely alien for them every time they visit. So that is why it affects a very large proportions, especially for the migratory animals. And some of the organisms, what they do is, for their living, they keep on moving and they cover a very large territory, and that's been there in their behavior. So if these large territories are taken out, that increases the competition between the same species, and again it will lead to the loss of life or loss of biodiversity. Okay, and next one is overexploitation. So humans are the examples for overexploitation because of we are straightforward concerned about human needs, and then we try to accumulate the resources that are not much required, but yet we do it, and we do it in a very unchecked proportions. So one of the best example is overpopulation and the increasing food demand. Okay, so for this we require more and more of fertile agricultural lands, and that we will turn up again into forests, and then we clear large amount of forest. Next one is the industries that depend upon natural resources. For example, large areas of forests have been created for the cultivation of tea, cultivation of coffee. Okay, and then you can also see that some of the greed, when it comes to human greed, you can see that a large unnecessarily we accumulate a large amount of furnitures. Okay, and then etc. So that is very, very bad. So over exploitation for food and shelter and the needs from the nature, so which goes beyond. And another example for over exploitation is overfishing. You can see that, right? So even though we are more concerned about the biodiversity, oceans are a part of biodiversity as well. So industrial fishing and overfishing and unchecked fishing has resulted in, as I told you, the elimination of life in the oceans. The oceans cannot be killed. So these factors are some of the reasons. Okay, so these are some of the examples for the overexploitation that is done by human beings. Okay, so some of the overexploited organisms are stellar sea calf, and then we have passenger pigeon. So they're extinct because of the overpopulation, overexploitation. Okay, next one is alien species invasion. This is a very, very sensitive area that we have to understand here. So, for example, Burmese python is an example for alien species, and then we have Nile perch is an example for alien species. A simple example is, let's say that one of the organism living in one ecosystem is taken from there and put into any other ecosystem. For example, in our country, we thought that the shapes of the shape and the flower, the shape of the leaves and the flower color of the water hyacinth is very beautiful, and we took it and introduced it to India. So that led to the Bengal terror. So why this happens? So one of the African catfish is also released in the waters of our lakes and rivers. So that has resulted again in the decline of the native species. So whenever we introduce an alien species, that is a species which is non-native to that particular habitat, so when we bring it and introduce it, now what will happen is it will lack natural predators. So whenever there are no predators to check the population of a particular species, now it will start invading the particular habitat where it will diminish the resources that are available for the native species. So they eat all the food that is available for the natives, and finally, what will happen is these native species, without knowing how to control it, they go extinct. Okay, it's a very serious threat, and because of the foolishness or because of the unknowing sensitivity about how the biodiversity, how the ecosystem works, so there are certain consequences such as introduction of Nile perch in East Africa. So that has led to the extinction of more than 200 species of native chilchad, okay, okay, chichil fishes in a particular lake, okay. So another example for alien species invasion, we have a very bright example, that is Parthenium, which is all around us, and then we have water hyacinth, and then we have lantana. So these are the examples for alien species, okay. So another example, as I told you, there is African catfish that has been introduced into our aquaculture in rivers and lakes and ponds. So that has resulted in the extinction of indigenous catfishes. Okay. So this is about alien invasion. So next one is co-extinction. What is co-extinction? See, when we look at our biodiversity, we know that the organisms are interdependent on each other. So now they're so sensitive that in the absence of these organisms, some other organism which is very, very closely related to its needs, such as food, shelter, or its influence in its environment, so that will lead to co-extinction. Okay. So for example, you can take the any of the organisms such as who is having a mutual relationship, sea anemone and crab. So if you eliminate any one of them, it will result in the death of the other. So that is called as coexistence, co-extinction. Okay. Okay, wait. So the next one is, why do we have to conserve biodiversity? The reasons for conservation of biodiversity comes in three ways. We have so many reasons to conserve biodiversity, but if you put all the reasons in a plate and we divide it in, so we get three important ways or reasons why we have to conserve biodiversity. It's a reason for conserving biodiversity. So that is coming under narrowly utilitarian, broadly utilitarian, and then we have ethical arguments. So let us see each of them. So when it comes to narrowly utilitarian arguments, so we know that we do it only when it benefits the human way of life. So humans are dependent upon so many narrowly benefited things for human greed, such as the furniture, construction material, okay, and the wood for the fire, okay, and then you have fibers, and then you have industrial products like resins, drugs, okay, etc. So we depend on them for our human products. So that is what is called as narrowly utilitarian. In narrowly utilitarian, what all comes here? Food, for firewood, fiber, construction material, industrial products such as tannins, resins, lubricants, dyes, perfumes, and also medicines. So it's very astonishing. It's not very astonishing. We know that at least more than 25% of the drugs that are in the market are derived from plants. Okay, around 25,000 species of the plants have medicinal value. Now, with the increasing loss of biodiversity, now we don't know how many plants have medicinal value, and they will not even be discovered because they will go extinct, and we won't even know they were existed. Okay, so that is narrowly utilitarian. So narrowly utilitarian arguments come under human-derived economic benefits. Okay, so remember this. And next one is broadly utilitarian. When we talk about broad utilitarian arguments, you take the whole of Earth, not just human beings. So you see how the richness in the species and the presence of biodiversity influence the entire climate. So now I told you that Earth is just a floating ball in the space, and it has its own engineering where it supports life. For example, oceans act as a huge carbon sink to remove carbon dioxide. They reflect a lot of sunlight, so that will create less warming of the surface. So we have a proper temperature control, we have precipitation, and we have the cycle of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then there is mineral cycle. So all this is broadly utilitarian. Okay. So if we cannot pay the bill for it, for the broadly utilitarian services that we acquire from the nature. Okay. For example, you have Amazon forest, which produces 20% of the total oxygen of Earth. Okay. And then pollination of bees and birds and bats. Okay. Which supports the life of planet. Okay. And then we have the pleasures, aesthetic pleasures, like the sound of the nature, okay, the sound of the waterfall, or the when you walk in the silent forest. So these things you cannot replace it. Okay, you can never uh, create an artificial simulation where you experience the same way that you experience in the outdoors or in the nature, right? So these are called as aesthetic pleasures. So broadly utilitarian arguments is trying to say that humans cannot pay a bill. See, it comes around $30 trillion if we have to pay for the services that we acquire from the nature only for oxygen alone. Okay. So you know that it is not possible to afford. We have seen that in the COVID situation, how expensive is oxygen. So now we get it for free. So those are broadly utilitarian services that we get from biodiversity. Next one is ethical arguments. So these ethical arguments have been a primary source for conservation of biodiversity. Now, the best example for ethical issues is, you know, that as a human being, as a conscious person, you don't want to literally go and destroy and take life away from this planet, right? So we feel that empathy, and we feel that they also need to coexist with each other. We are not superior, we are just same, but with a little bit of consciousness. And we can use this consciousness to save our, all the organisms across the planet. Now, coming to the earlier days, we know that many of our own biodiversity hotspots, such as in Karnataka, Maharashtra, and if you see in Kashi, or if you see in Himalayan region, so in Rajasthan, so if you take in many of these places, the place is considered sacred, and coexistence with many of the animals is felt very precious, and they are also given spiritual value. For example, the king cobras in South India, right? We have given spiritual value, or peacocks, okay, or lions and tigers, on elephants. So we give very spiritual value. That makes us give respect and get the respect, and promote the coexistence among the communities. So this ethical arguments, even though it looks very primitive, but the impact it has had on the biodiversity is very large. So that means it is supporting the cause for conservation of biodiversity. So this is a very good way to just appreciate nature in higher form. Okay. So this is ethical argument. So basically, you care for the well-being of where you live in. Next one is biodiversity and conservation. So when we talk about conservation of biodiversity, it is, how do we say biodiversity? So it is a very, very huge or a very, very huge assignment to take up. So if you look at the biodiversity conservation, we know that it is such a large scope, or such a huge mammoth task to do it, but we don't have the enough resources or the manpower to do it. You know the reasons, right? So now when we talk about conservation of biodiversity, there are two ways we can do it with the resources available. One is on-site conservation, on off-site conservation, which we call it as in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. So when we talk about in situ conservation and ex situ conservation, the idea behind it is to understand the dynamics of that particular situation. Now, when we talk about the conservation of lions in Africa, or the zebras, or wildebeest, or any of these animals, it's a very large ecosystem. So we try to protect the entire ecosystem on site. Okay. For example, protection of Western Ghats. Okay. From fragmentation and habitat loss by government laws. So we don't take the animals from Western Ghats and we put it in the zoos or something like that. Okay. So this is on-site conservation within the natural boundaries. Okay. So not the human-made ecosystem. Such as, you have examples for in situ conservation, very important. National parks, sanctuaries, biosphere reserves, and cultural landscapes. And then we have natural monuments. So India is very, very blessed to have a lot of biodiversity. So that has resulted in 14 biospheres. We have 14 biosphere reserves in India, 90 national parks, and then we have 448 wildlife sanctuaries across India. So which is a very good news, right? So globally, it has been done where the in situ conservation to protect organisms within their territory. Okay, so some of the wildlife where private ownership, cultivation, and grazing are also prohibited. Okay, for example, Ernakulam National Park in Kerala is an example. All right, next one. So when we talk about some of the between this in situ conservation and the local communities. When we have local communities do depend on the forest. So that is why a small portion of the forest called as buffer regions are provided for the local people, where they take the ownership and they take the natural resources from there, and they do not harm any of the wild animals. Okay, for example, is Periyar Wildlife Sanctuary again in Kerala. All right. So next one, another example for in situ conservation is coastal ecosystems and conservation of the beaches, beach sides. Okay, so here also it's done, on-site conservation. So now when we talk about some of the protected areas based on religious beliefs, like ethical issues, when we talked about, right? So example is sacred groves in Kashi, and we have Jainita Hills in Meghalaya. Next one is Aravali Hills of Rajasthan, then Western Ghats region of Karnataka and Maharashtra, and then we have Sarguja, and then we have Chanda, and then Bastar areas of Madhya Pradesh. So they're all conserved on site with the religious beliefs, and they're protected very well by the local communities as well as the people around that particular area. Next one is ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is done for the organisms which are highly in the risk of extinction. So they're brought from their natural habitats and they are given habilitation centers, okay, where they are provided every facility for them to survive. Okay, so some of this ex situ conservation involves genetic resources centers, zoological parks, wildlife sanctuaries, botanical gardens, gene banks, and then we have cryopreservation. All right, so let's look at. So when we talk about ex situ conservation, one thing, the organisms which are highly in the threat of going extinct, for them we do this ex situ conservation. Okay, whereas so these are the examples. So ex situ conservation, now what we're doing is with the accelerated loss of biodiversity, we are trying to collect the genetic samples of these organisms and preserve it under extremely low temperature. And that is called as cryopreservation. Okay, so with that we create gene banks and we store the genetic data in the computers. Okay, so you know about zoological parks and wildlife sanctuaries and botanical gardens, right? So next one. So what are biodiversity hotspots? So when we talk about biodiversity hotspots, so several biodiversity hotspots are declared across the world where they are very, very unique and they host a very important species for that ecosystem, right? So they have a lot of species richness. So now when we have 34 hotspots in the world, in that three hotspots cover India's biodiversity regions such as Western Ghats, Sri Lanka, and then Indo-Burma and the Himalayas are added to this biodiversity hotspots. Okay, so see, all the hotspots, they cover only 2% of the Earth's land, but the richness of the species is extremely high and they occupy almost 80% of the living organisms. Okay, so now with the protection of the biodiversity hotspots, we have successfully reduced extinction by 30%. Okay, next one. So when we talk about some of the factors, some of the what do you tell? Some of the decisions taken by the international communities. So we have something called as Earth Summit. Earth Summit was conducted in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. So the objective of this Earth Summit was to conserve Earth, okay, and the biodiversity. So these are the objectives. One is conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of biodiversity, and sharing benefits, arising from genetic resources. So these were the that was held in 1992. First time a summit was held in on a planet where people were showing the concern towards the loss of biodiversity. A lot of artists, a lot of songwriters and lyricists and movie makers and many eminent leaders, they pushed this to happen, and this happened in 1992. whereas the World Summit again was held in Johannesburg in 2002. So here it was about the sustainable development. Sustainable development defines that you use it, but you don't overexploit it, and you understand the supply and demand. Okay, I conserve it as well as use it. So that is called a sustainable development, so that we have it for the future generations. Okay, so 190 countries participated, and they pledged to the reduce of the loss of biodiversity. Okay, so now, so thank you very much. So here we complete the entire syllabus. So if you have any doubts, now I will be here. You can ask me. JNV Bhavnagar, are you there?